All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on who pays for repair costs in the multi-tenant AIR CRE leases. I'll give a little bit of background. I am the managing partner of Consensus Legal. Consensus Legal focuses on commercial sales, leases, and leasing and financing transactions. The AIR CRE contracts that you are familiar with, they are so well drafted. They make transactions easier to complete, and they are the best contracts, real estate contracts in the nation, in my opinion. A couple of disclaimers: AIR Forms Practitioner is not affiliated with or sponsored by AIR CRE. I'm not providing legal advice during these webinars. It is for education and discussion purposes. Okay, so for today's 20-minute webinar, we will focus on repair and maintenance obligations in the multi-tenant leases. After the webinar, I'll stay on for another 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. Okay, so what is the general rule with respect to multi-tenant leasing in terms of repair and maintenance responsibilities? The general rule in commercial leasing for multi-tenant projects is that the premises is the responsibility of lessee, and the areas outside of the premises, the common areas, are the responsibility of lessor. Those are the two key general rules in multi-tenant leasing. So what we'll do during this webinar is two things. First, we're going to flush out those concepts a little bit and clarify lessee's responsibilities with respect to the premises. And secondly, we are going to focus on deviations from those two general rules. What I mean when I say deviations are situations where lessee is responsible for areas outside of the premises, and conversely, where lessor is responsible for areas within the premises, the deviations from the general rule. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share the multi-tenant net lease, and hopefully you all can see that. And just to orient ourselves, paragraph 7.1 of the AIR CRE leases relates to lessee's obligations to repair and maintain, and 7.2 relates to lessor's obligations. Okay, so the general rule that lessee is responsible for the premises is right at the beginning of 7.1a. Lessee shall, at lessee's sole expense, keep the premises in good order, condition, and repair. That is the general rule that we talked about. But the AIR CRE lease doesn't just leave it at that. It flushes out this concept in a very thoughtful way. And the first way it flushes it out, this concept that lessee, this general rule that lessee is responsible to keep the premises in good order, condition, and repair, is with this parenthetical. Whether or not the portion of the premises requiring repairs or the means of repairing the same are reasonably or readily accessible to lessee, and whether or not the need for such repairs occurs as a result of lessee's use, any prior use, the elements, or the age of such portion of the premises. So an example here would be a lighting fixture. Let's say this building is only 10 years old, but a lighting fixture, and lessee is 1 year into its lease, and a lighting fixture is no longer working. And lessee didn't didn't cause any damage to it. It just stopped working. This parenthetical clarifies that even though this lighting fixture just kind of failed based on its useful life, lessee is responsible for making sure that lighting fixture is fixed and is in good order, condition, and repair. The other example I can bring up is a plumbing line. If there's a line that in the bathroom of the premises and it breaks, unless you didn't do anything wrong, it just failed. It doesn't matter that it's behind a wall, for example, of the bathroom. Lessee is still responsible to make sure it's repaired and in good condition. That's the first clarification to this general rule. And then the AIR CRE lease goes on to give examples of portions of the premises that lessee is responsible for. It says including but not limited to all equipment or facilities such as plumbing, HVAC equipment, electrical, lighting facilities, boilers, pressure vessels, fixtures, interior surfaces of exterior walls, ceilings, floors, windows, doors, plate glass, and skylights. So these are just examples of portions of the premises that lessee is responsible at its sole expense to keep in good order, condition, and repair. The AIR CRE lease also flushes this concept out further with this sentence here. Lessee's obligations shall include restorations, replacements, or renewals when necessary to keep the premises and all improvements thereon or a part thereof in good order, condition, and state of repair. So that example where the lighting fixture is not working and it actually needs to be replaced. This clarifies that the obligation of lessee to keep the premises in good order, condition, and repair includes replacement of that lighting fixture. So that is the general rule, and in furtherance of lessee's obligation to keep the premises in good order, condition, and repair, lessee is also required to obtain service contracts. And with respect to the multi-tenant leases, and let me take a step back for the moment. When I say multi-tenant leases, I'm referring to the multi-tenant lease net that we're going over, as well as the gross lease. Both leases are the same for purposes of the content of this webinar. So we don't need to go back and forth and compare the two. The concepts are the same. So with respect to service contracts, to the extent there are clarifiers in the premises and boiler and pressure vessels, lessee is required to obtain service contracts for those. And lessee is also required to obtain a service contract for that key item, the HVAC equipment. And lessee pays at its sole expense for those service contracts. So this is how the AIR CRE multi-tenant leases flush out the concept, this general rule that lessee is responsible to keep the premises in good order, condition, and repair. But I noted earlier that there are deviations from this general rule, in particular, one deviation. And that deviation is up here in 7.1a. And when I say deviation, as a reminder, I'm talking about a scenario where lessee is responsible to maintain areas outside of the premises. And that deviation is with respect to utility installations. So if you have well, let me just read it. So lessee shall, at lessee's sole expense, keep the premises, and here it says utility installations intended for lessee's exclusive use, no matter where located. Excuse me. So if you have a multi-tenant project, one building, 5 tenants, let's say, and each of those 5 tenants has its own dedicated HVAC, and components of the HVAC system are on the roof. Well, under this provision, even though there are portions of the HVAC system that are not within the premises, that are on the roof, if it's exclusively dedicated to lessee, then lessee is responsible. So that is the key deviation from the general rule, where lessee is responsible for an aspect outside of the premises. Now, the other general rule that we talked about earlier is the situation where the other general rule is lessor is responsible for the common areas. And what deviations exist where lessor is responsible for areas within the premises? And those are described in 7.2, but just to point out this provision in 7.1a, this refers to those carve-outs. So yes, lessee is responsible in 7.1a for the premises to keep it in good order, condition, and repair. Here are some examples, but it says importantly, but excluding any items which are the responsibility of lessor pursuant to paragraph 7.2. So let's go to 7.2, lessor's obligations. And here, lessor is responsible, and it's subject to reimbursement. This is a multi-tenant lease. So lessor gets reimbursed for these maintenance and repair responsibilities. So lessor subject to reimbursement pursuant to paragraph 4.2 shall keep in good order, condition, and repair. And here's the first deviation, where lessor is responsible potentially for aspects within the premises. These are, you can characterize as structural, the structural deviation. So if there is some structural aspect of the interior bearing wall that needs an interior bearing wall within the premises that needs to be repaired or maintained, lessor is responsible. Lessor is responsible for the other structural aspects, foundation, exterior walls. So that is the first deviation where lessor can be responsible for aspects within the premises. The second key deviation is with respect to the fire life safety system. Fire sprinklers, common area fire alarm, and or smoke detection systems. To the extent those aspects are within the premises, like a fire sprinkler system, in that scenario, lessee is not responsible to repair and maintain that. It is lessor. And these other areas lessor is responsible for can generally be described as, common areas, exterior areas, etc. Okay, so we've talked about the key general rule. We've talked about deviations from the general rule. An additional item that I want to address is replacement. Under 7.1D. So if there are major items, certain major items that need to be replaced, the AIR CRE lease, consistent with commercial leasing standards generally, does not put the entire burden on lessee. And let's get into this concept. So if an item described in paragraph 7.1b cannot be repaired other than at a cost which is in excess of 50% of the cost of replacing such item, then the cost is shared. So let's talk about the items described in 7.1b. These are the items for which lessee is obligated to obtain service contracts. So the key item here is HVAC equipment. It includes boiler and pressure vessels and clarifiers to the extent the premises has any. But the key one, of course, that comes up a lot in commercial leasing is HVAC equipment. So if one of these items, like HVAC equipment, cannot be repaired at a cost which is in excess of 50% of replacing, then how do the parties deal with this scenario? Well, number one, such item is replaced by lessor. So lessor takes the lead in replacing the item. And with respect to the cost, how is that cost shared? That cost is prorated between the parties. And lessee is only responsible for one 144th per month. So let me just explain that in plain English. Basically, the cost of the HVAC replacement would be amortized over 12 years. Let's say it's a 5-year lease, and lessee only has 1 year remaining in its lease term when the HVAC equipment needs to be replaced. Since it's amortized over 12 years and lessee only has 1 year remaining, lessee will only pay 1/12 of that cost. Now, what about a scenario where lessee exercises a 5-year option to extend and ends up leasing it for 6 years after the replacement? Then lessee would be responsible for 6/12 or 1/2 of the cost of that replacement. And to point out this detail, which is an important detail, lessor can charge interest on the cost of replacing at a 10% rate pursuant to the AIR lease, but lessee can prepay its obligation. So that's replacement. And before I get into the 20-minute Q&A, I will just mention one more concept, which is important to lessors, and that concept is the failure to perform in 7.1c. So if lessee is not repairing and maintaining the premises in good order, condition, and repair, what is lessor's remedy? One of lessor's remedies is here in 7.1c. Lessor may enter upon the premises after 10 days written notice to lessee and perform such obligations on lessee's behalf. So lessor can go in there and do the work. And if in fact the lessor does do that, lessee has to pay lessor not just the cost to repair, but an additional 15%. So 115% of the cost. So I will leave it at that. As I noted, these provisions are the same between the multi-tenant net and gross leases. And I will happy to answer any questions, and I'll check the chat box to see if any questions are in there as well. Joseph, yep, good question. These concepts apply to both the gross and net leases. These provisions are the same. Multi-tenant gross and multi-tenant net. Joseph also asked, in your example of the bathroom pipe, does lessee's responsibility cover the portion of the pipe that is outside of the premises? If that needs to be repaired, that likely would be lessor's responsibility because it falls in the common areas. That's my understanding. Marty asks, can you further elaborate on repairs related to plumbing? Yeah, so I guess the same question. So yeah, if there's a plumbing issue that is the result of a rupture of a line in the common areas, that's not within the premises, so it would be lessor's responsibility. Gabriella, good question here. Who would be responsible for fire extinguishers? They're not specifically mentioned. Will they be part of the fire safety system? That is a really good question. And I have to pull up the lease again. So in 7.2, lessee is responsible for the fire sprinkler system. That's not a fire extinguisher. And also the common area fire alarm and or smoke detection systems. So it doesn't use the term fire safety system. I kind of shorthanded it. So here 7.2 doesn't say specifically fire extinguishers. So I would lean toward lessee being responsible. But that's a great question. I think you kind of stumped me on that one, but I think it's lessee. Bill asks, can the unamortized portion be applied to the next tenant? That's a really good question, Bill. Yes, it absolutely can under the net lease. Under the net lease, lessees are responsible for, the. So let me start with the gross lease. The gross lease you're paying, I think under both. I think under both because the multi-tenant gross is an industrial gross lease, so to speak, where lessee, yes, the lessee's paying increases in taxes and insurance, but it's paying all of the common area operating expenses, not just over a base year. So it might require a tweak to 4.2. That might get into some of the details of 4.2, which are a little bit outside of the scope. If I have time, or maybe after, Bill, maybe you can send me a message on that and I can try to address it. But in general, it might require a tweak to the AIR CRE contract. Ken asks, okay, I think it's the same question. Glenn, where does it say tenant pays 10% interest for capital expenditures over 144 months? Okay, let's go to that. So we're in the replacement 7.1D for replacement of HVAC equipment, for example. Such items shall be replaced by lessor, and the cost thereof shall be prorated between the parties. And then this last sentence here, it says lessee shall pay interest on the unamortized balance, but may prepay its obligation at any time. And the 10% interest, so you'll notice it says lessor shall pay interest, and the term interest is capitalized. That's a defined term in the AIR lease, and it's defined in paragraph 13. Scrolling down, paragraph 13, here it is, 13.5, interest. And the defined term interest is 10% per annum. I hope that answers your question. Jen has a question about the office lease. That's a little bit outside of the scope. That would be a bit of a long deviation. My apologies, I can't get to that one. If Sean asks if lessor has to upgrade the fire sprinkler system due to a requirement from an insurer, can lessor pass through the cost of this upgrade? Some good questions here. 2.3 of the AIR CRE leases deal with modifications required as a result of a change in applicable law. And it deals with allocating the responsibility between the parties in that scenario. Your question is a little different. It's an upgrade that's required as a result of an insurer. And I think you stumped me, Sean, offhand. I would have to get into the details there and look at that more carefully. Tim asks, what about the roof? That is not, multi-tenant project, Tim. The roof is not within the premises, and it is not lessee's responsibility. That's on the lessor. Matt asks, is there a warranty period for new tenants within which lessee's maintenance would fall to lessor? Great question, Matt. And the answer is yes. There is a warranty period for items within the premises that fail. And that is the subject of another webinar I've done in the past on paragraph 2.2 of the AIR CRE lease. And the AIR CRE lease contains what I refer to as the premises warranty. And in the premises warranty, lessor warrants that the building systems are in good operating condition, and all other elements in the unit, that the structural elements of the roof, bearing walls, and foundation are free of material defects, no hazardous levels of mold or fungi. So yes, if one of these, if some aspect of the plumbing, like the plumbing line we talked about in the bathroom, or a lighting fixture, if that fails within 30 days, then lessor is responsible to repair that and put it in good order and condition. There's a special warranty for the HVAC system, which is 6 months. So great question, Matt. And yes, if those aspects within the premises fail within the applicable warranty periods, then lessor, not lessee, is responsible. And please note that those warranty periods, 6 months and 30 days, begin from the start date, which is the earlier of the commencement date or early possession. So keep that in mind. That's a nuance that some people Don't realize. Rick asks, in a multi-tenant building, would the landlord always be responsible for all roof repairs? No, there probably are some exceptions. If lessee causes damage, um, you know, we've seen scenarios where lessee is performing repair and maintenance. It's HVAC contractor is performing maintenance on the HVAC on the roof and does a poor job of sealing, for example. So I guess there are some limited scenarios where the lessee would be responsible, but the general rule you have correct. Alejandro asks 7.2. Okay. You would like clarification on the subject to reimbursement provision in 7.2. So let's go back to 7.2. And in 7.2, lessors obligations to repair and maintain in 7.2, as Alejandro mentioned, are subject to reimbursement pursuant to paragraph 4.2. So let's go to 4.2. And by the way, 4.2 is the subject of an earlier webinar. My webinars are on YouTube, so they can be viewed at any time. And yeah, 4.2 relates to common area operating expenses. And in 4.2, lessor has broad ability to pass through the cost of repair and maintenance of the common areas. So I think generally, Alejandro, that's what I mean. When we say, or when the AIR CRE lease says subject to reimbursement, the repair and maintenance that lessor is doing pursuant to 7.2, particularly with respect to the common areas, these are subject to reimbursement. And as we noted earlier, the multi-tenant gross lease is an industrial gross lease structure. So lessee is paying not just common area operating expenses over a base year, it's paying the common area expenses in its entirety. Of course, their share of it. Jen asks, are lessee responsibilities under all of our commercial leases? If you could clarify, Jen, that would be appreciated. Elaborate on that question, please. Joseph asks, how can you charge the next tenant for something that happened before he leased the space? Okay, let me try to get into that issue of the amortization. And I got into that issue in a lot more detail in that earlier webinar on common area operating expenses. And Romanet 9, 4.2A9 of the AIR lease. This is the net lease. Lessor shall allocate the cost of any such capital improvement over a 12-year period, and lessee is required, shall not be required to pay more than 1/144th. And there are some differences between the net and gross leases with respect to paragraph 4.2. So it's an issue that has come up twice in this question and answer session, but I think it would be a very lengthy answer to try to get into these nuances. So my apologies if I can just refer you to the webinar I've done on paragraph 4.2, common area operating expenses. We get into those issues in a lot more detail. Gabriella asks, oh yes, the fire extinguisher question. Gabriella asks a practical question. Would it be safe to reference paragraph 7.1 when notifying the tenants via letter that they need to be serviced? So I think these are the service contracts. Yeah, that's something you could certainly do. Remind lessee of its obligation to obtain service contracts. And that would be a great service that you could provide to your lessee clients. And one other reason that's important, Gabriella, is because of what Matt alluded to earlier, which was the warranties. In my earlier webinar on the premises warranty and 2.2, there's an important provision here that people don't really see all the time. This premises warranty that I talked about of 6 months for the HVAC and 30 days with respect to the other elements, there's a condition to that warranty. And that condition is so long as the required service contracts below are obtained by lessee and in effect within 30 days following the start date. So you want to make sure your clients don't lose out on that warranty, and ideally they would obtain those service contracts sooner rather than later. Joseph asked, would you have the same webinar for a single tenant lease net? Great question, Joseph. Yes, my last webinar was on the single tenant leases, net and gross. And this is exactly what we dealt with. Who has repair and maintenance responsibilities between lessor and lessee? It's on YouTube. So yeah, you can view it anytime. Justin asks regarding ADA, is the landlord or tenant responsible for making common area ADA upgrades? Specifically, I've seen deal blow up because tenant is simply trying to install a racking system. So generally speaking, lessor is responsible for modifications and upgrades outside of the premises. However, there are some exceptions to that. And I'm going to go to, hopefully I can find it in short order. At least one of the exceptions. I think in 7.3 relating to alterations. Maybe this is the sentence. There might be something more specific, but my understanding is that if an alteration that lessee is making triggers a modification requirement, then lessee would be responsible, even if it is outside of the premises. And we're running low on time. Joseph asks, how do I search on YouTube? AIR Forms Practitioner. You can do a search for AIR Forms Practitioner and you can see our videos. And then final question from Matt, lessee wants to use their own employees to service and maintain the HVAC equipment servicing their space. What is the minimum level of certification or expertise mandated in the AIR lease? That's a good question. And I mean, if we go back to 7.1b and parse the language, it says lessee shall, at lessee's sole expense, procure and maintain contracts with contractors specializing and experienced in the maintenance of the following equipment. So contractors to me indicates a third party. There's no option here for an employee of lessee, even if they're experienced, to do the maintenance of these, the HVAC equipment, for example. So I would say that it is not permitted under the AIR CRE lease. And if lessee wants to service the HVAC in that way, it would have to, modify the AIR CRE lease. So we've reached 20 minutes, 40 total. I want to respect your time. So thank you, everybody, so much for joining the webinar. There'll be another one soon. And if you have any questions or follow-up, feel free to email me. Thank you so much.